Thank you very much, Susan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So when we talk about conversations taking place between Asia and the West, what does that bring to mind to you? What sort of flashes in front of you? What does that mean?
It means to me opportunities for uh, collaboration, but also opportunities for conflict. Opportunities are great, but the risk of conflict is increasing as well, as evident in what's going on in the South China Sea. So it's a very critical juncture, I think, in the history of East and West.
I feel the same, and I'm fascinated that you brought up the dual side of this. Now you've lived really in Asia since, let's see, how many years ago was it that you actually went to Asia? Quite a
Uh,
while.
94, yeah, 1994. So 22 years so far.
Okay, so how has the dialogue shifted during that time?
Well, when I came out to Asia back in 1994, I mean, it was really exciting times. Emerging markets was expanding rapidly. China was still quite backwards. With Morgan Stanley, I was part of the original team to help set up China's first joint venture with China Construction Bank. It was really exciting. The Chinese respected the West quite a lot and saw us as having critical experience and skills and look forward to the technology transfer from the West to the East. And the folks at headquarters just had so much going on with international expansion that we were afforded quite a bit of authority and responsibility. And things moved very, very fast. And we felt empowered, and it was just really, really exciting. We worked crazy, crazy hours, but it was a lot of fun. And so you didn't think about how much you worked, how long you worked. You didn't even worry about how much you got paid. It was just so fun to be building new things in Asia. So that was then, and it was a good ride for some time. It was really a lot of fun. But I think post financial crisis in 2008, things started to change dramatically. So there was a much higher risk aversion mindset within most, corporate hallways, and things started to slow down significantly. And the dynamic too between the U.S. or the West and the East also started to change, because since being admitted into the WTO back in 2000, China just grew at a phenomenal pace. They quickly outgrew Morgan Stanley, for example. So it became clear that after about 5 years, they had kind of learned the tricks of the trade, and they wanted to take more control of that joint venture. And so we got relegated to kind of the back seat and became more of a passive investor. Still a very great investment, still a wonderful venture, but it wasn't a venture which we could manage and control anymore. And so that's kind of a microcosm of what was going on across China. I think across industry, the Chinese were amassing significant experience and significant skills very, very quickly, and they, especially following the financial crisis, it kind of dawned on them that, hey, maybe our teachers don't know as much as we had credited them with, with all their foresight, with all their risk management capabilities, how did this happen? And whilst we were, kind of accused of being so backwards and so conservative, why do we seem to, come out of this in better shape? So I think the mental psychology began to change, and over the years, it's evolved into, I think, a greater sense of pride, a greater sense of, hey, I don't need to, defer everything anymore to others, and I'm kind of the master of my own destiny. So that psychology has been changing over the years. Yeah, and I guess because of that, a lot of U.S. multinationals, sense, greater and greater difficulty in kind of securing the land, right, for their business, And therefore, with problems elsewhere, with better opportunities elsewhere, I think the investment in China, started to lose its luster. And whereas before they really needed, the generals on the front line to help them grow the business, with the scale back, with resistance coming in from China, both from a regulatory perspective as well as from entrenched incumbent corporations who are gaining power and strength. A lot of multinationals decided to scale back, and so the empowerment, the delegation, just grew smaller and smaller over the years.
It's interesting. I suppose when you were talking about conversation, I imagine when you're in the West, people think you can explain all things Chinese and vice versa.
Exactly.
how accurate do you think the Chinese understanding of the West is? And I'd be interested to hear just the other way around. How much do you think that China really understands about how the West thinks and operates, and vice versa?
I don't think either side understands each other well enough. And I think, as with human beings, once a mindset develops, it becomes difficult to change that mindset. And that's what I'm particularly worried about. So, I've grown up on both sides of not the pond, the big pond, and I appreciate the strengths of both, and I see the potential and the opportunities, but I'm afraid more and more people see the not so attractive side of the other, and I think that comes out of ignorance. I think that comes out of lack of sufficient information. I mean, even very, very bright, very, very well-informed writers at The Economist have captured, the facts and the data so eloquently, but I think they're missing some elements, and those elements can sway one's opinion to a significant degree. So it's quite unfortunate. I think both China does not understand the West and increasingly understands the West less, and likewise, I think the West increasingly doesn't understand China and is becoming increasingly fearful of China. So that's an unfortunate development.
And it's interesting, isn't it? There's an irony here in that we've never been more technologically able to have major communications. But I think, my bias is that face-to-face conversation is really the name of the game, and it's when we actually get to places, meet people, see them in their own milieu, that we think, oh my gosh, we do have much more in common than we thought we did. And in fact, we could do a lot more in a collaborative mode than any other one. So that's one of the reasons for this curated conversation. I'm really fixated on the need for people really understanding how each other thinks, and sometimes just hearing each other talk is helpful.
I agree with you completely, and that was the reason for my pause in answering your question, because I thought, surely in this day of the internet, instant information, right? People ought to understand each other better, but that's actually not what we see. It's kind of sad.
Well, let's see what we can do about it. So let's talk for a minute about what's on the mind of. Let's talk about what is on the mind of a lot of people who have an interest in China, and that is the recent downturn in the Chinese economy. What is happening, and how is that impact being felt?
Yeah, China is growing at a much slower pace than it did earlier. That everyone is very fixated on, 10% before, or 10% plus before, and now only 6.7. But, let's not forget that 6.7 is still a very, very high rate of growth compared to, 1 to 2% in most developed markets, and sometimes a negative GDP growth in quite a lot of countries. So it is still, in absolute terms, a very, very good number. And providing that everything stays the same, China continues to be on an upward trajectory in terms of its GDP. It's already surpassed Japan, and it's on a path to intersect the U.S. unless things completely blow up. So the GDP has slowed, but it's still a very healthy rate of growth. And I think that there's some who would argue that the slowdown in China was not an accident, but was instead engineered by the government of China, specifically in response to a lot of the travails as highlighted in the economy. So, I think if you're a leader and you see this rapid economic growth built upon low-end manufacturing, feed, the developed markets, that model is just not sustainable. As wages rise, it becomes a sunset industry. And in the pursuit of, rapid growth, a lot of things got sidelined. So it was quantity in place of quality. And, on the Chinese side, it's understood that the government actually intentionally decided to focus more on quality rather than on quantity, still a respectable rate of growth, but to instead divert energies toward ensuring that, the economy gets grown at a healthy clip, in a more controlled and in a more sustainable way. So I think there's a positive side to this. It's not all negative.
Well, that's especially interesting, I think, when you think about the individuals on the ground now who have, anybody who was born 30 years ago or less in China has been living in a country where growth has been truly exponential, something that their parents certainly couldn't have envisioned being so strong and so sustained. But I would imagine that there is some sense of, oh my gosh, this golden trajectory on which we were placed somehow now seems not quite the same opportunity it was before. So is there that sense, especially in the middle class, that what's happened here, am I gonna not be able to continue living as well as I have been? Is there fear of that?
Yeah, there definitely is fear of that. I think, what we see in the rest of the world in terms of people who had acquired assets earlier, who have amassed wealth earlier, are able to increase the value of that wealth at a much faster clip than people who, became middle class later, who see these opportunities increasingly elusive. I think this is not just a China issue, it's a global phenomenon. The divide between the rich and the poor continues to grow. And it impacts, too, millennials and how they think about their lives and about their future. And that's why we see a lot of the problems that we see around the world. So China is certainly not immune to that.
That's certainly true. Now, have individuals there become more vocal about their concerns? I'm interested in their willingness to speak up to authority. Westerners view Chinese as reluctant to do that. And of course, they read or they hear about punishment to those who take on the government. How real is that? Are people feeling that they have a voice? Are they expressing it? And what's the ramification of that?
I think people are expressing it in areas where they believe they have maybe some room for influence. So people have certainly been vocal about the air pollution in China. And we've seen the government really rolling up its sleeves to try to address that. We've seen people become very vocal about, the excessive rapid rate of growth in China. The high-speed rail derailments a few years back led to a lot of government scrutiny on, do we have enough focus on safety in public transportation? The Tianjin explosion, it's just the careless disregard for adherence to regulation. That's got increased government scrutiny on those. So those are situations where, when there's a public outcry, WeChat channels just go crazy. There's no suppression of that kind of dissent. But if it's about challenging the authority of the government, if it's questioning the leadership, that's where you can expect a clampdown. So the clampdown on NGOs, I think there might be some there's a lot of focus on why is China clamping down on NGOs. From what I hear from the Chinese circles, is because a lot of organizations have been using NGOs to try to challenge the government, and so challenge the government in areas where it's very, very important to the West in terms of human rights. But from a Chinese perspective, they're more focused on ensuring that the country continues to run in a stable fashion and continues to grow in a sustainable manner. So I guess they're a bit more practical. They want to make sure that the physical needs of the country get addressed first before the spiritual needs, kind of in accordance with Maslow's hierarchy.
Interesting. Okay.
But it's you can kind of see both sides of the story. Yes, you can see the importance of what these NGOs are trying to do, but at the same time, you can also see that China recognizes it's got not an easy problem to direct a country of 1.6, 1.7 billion people across vast geographies, 30 plus provinces. And it can't afford to be a democracy yet. I mean, they point to examples in Russia, they point to examples in Taiwan and other democracies which have just kind of gone out of control. And I think, we all studied in history class the most efficient form of government is a benevolent dictatorship. So I guess, whether you agree or not, whether you view them as totalitarian or authoritarian, maybe in the eyes of the Chinese leadership, and I think across most of the Chinese people, they view the leadership as a benevolent dictator. And so as long as you're benevolent, as long as you're taking care of, the physical needs of the people, making sure that people are well fed and taken care of, as long as you do that, they don't challenge your authority. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what China's trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about immigration, though? It is true that some of China's wealthy people, as well as its very bright people, have left the country or are leaving the country. Is that as big an issue as some Westerners have been led to believe that it is? Do you see a lot of that?
There is certainly a lot of migration of people as well as assets outside of China. And part of that is, I agree with, part of that is a lack of confidence by the Chinese in China. There's definitely disillusionment in the slowdown of the China economy. There's definitely a lack of confidence with the renminbi and where it's going because it's been depreciating. There's a lack of confidence about just the level of safety and the quality of life here. I mean, the air pollution has been targeted by the government, but they're still, far away from being able to completely address it. So a lot of people, for quality of life issues, for, diversification of assets issue, for the opportunity to, provide an environment where their kids can enjoy an international education that's not, just kind of a very draconian, just memorize this and memorize that. I think a lot of people do aspire to immigrate overseas to send their kids abroad.
Now I remember that you said that when we talked about innovation at one point, and it seems to me that now for those that remain in China, and that's a lot of people, some would say that a crucial requirement, maybe more crucial than ever, is for China to become even more innovative in order to solve not only these pressing large-scale issues like environmental pollution and healthcare and so on, but also to really make this move successfully from the earlier export model. So what about this opportunity for innovation? We know about Alibaba and Tencent. There's no question that that it is alive in a great way. But where will increased innovation come from? Will it be from the expats who used to be sort of looked at as the source of this? Will it be the young people educated in the West who return and eventually take over businesses, or will it be homegrown? And I know we'll talk about the educational system in a second, but just where will this innovation come from from your perspective?
I think it'll come from the millennials, from the young people, wherever they are, whether they're educated overseas, whether they're young people coming to China because they see that there are opportunities here to innovate and to grow and to explore new markets. I don't think there's a demographic monopoly with respect to where this innovation comes from. It'll just come from need. So a lot of it would come from people that are indigenous to China because they're the most well aware of what the local market needs. But if they're if people who kind of grew up in the traditional channels of education, would find it more, how should I say, they're not trained to innovate because they're trained just to memorize and just to follow instructions in a very hierarchical way. So that just doesn't fuel innovation, which is also why a lot of the parents now want their kids to have Western education because they recognize the creativity that fosters, the value of that for innovation. So. Yeah, I think for innovation to happen in China, it would come from the young people, the millennials, but it would be a combination of people who grew up here who are aware of the needs, plus people from the outside coming in. I don't think there's a monopoly to this for any demographic.
So, Lyndon, I know you serve as a trustee of the Shanghai International School, and my understanding is it's the largest international school in China. Now, I take it the approach of that school is to teach the kind of critical thinking that you think is not true of the traditional Chinese education, which reinforces the hierarchical structure that is not so helpful, especially in terms of innovation. Yep. So, how are you guys going to scale this sort of thing? How do you do that in a country that large with such an entrenched educational system? Is this something that's just going to take a long time, or will there be a real disruption of the traditional educational process?
Yeah, I think there's growing recognition that our style of education at schools like the Shanghai American School, where on the surface it looks like kids are just playing and they're just having fun, but actually they're learning. Where the emphasis is placed not on learning content, but on learning skills and learning how to be resourceful in a changing and dynamic world to get information wherever it's sourced and to be able to use that information effectively. I think that is definitely what we do at Shanghai American School and other international schools, and there's insatiable demand for that kind of education. Unfortunately, in China, there are regulations from the Ministry of Education which limit the students who enroll at schools like ours to those who hold foreign passports. So by definition, we are capped in our growth. So we have historically catered to expat families, people who hold foreign passports. Honestly, all of the international schools are facing big challenges in enrollment because as multinationals scale down, as they send their expats back, as they replace expats with locals, the customer base continues to shrink, and therefore a lot of schools now are cropping up offering what they call bilingual education. These are still controlled by the Ministry of Education. They need to adhere to strict curriculum guidelines up through grade 9. and then they're free to kind of be more creative in the high school years. But there's this huge demand for this kind of education. But currently there are some controls by the Ministry of Education, and they want to make sure that people don't get completely brainwashed by Western values. So I concur with that part of the Economist article. They want to make sure that they still have control over how people think in China, and therefore we're kind of capped with respect to how much we can grow.
That's so interesting, based on the tremendous demand there is on the part of parents, and I would imagine, especially for those who can't afford to send their kids to private schools, that pressure will become even greater. And who knows? It sounds like a major business opportunity, actually. So,
if I could elaborate a little bit further on that, it's kind of interesting how how this. Modern warfare is no longer about military might. It's kind of shifted over to the economy, but it's also shifting over to ideology. So I don't know if I'm reading beyond the tea leaves, but if you take a look at the new SAT, they've intentionally made it a lot more accessible to people who grow up in an American educational system. So, for example, the SAT verbal, they try to use words that are more, commonly seen and commonly used, rather than words that are just difficult, but you never use them in your lifetime. They try to embed in all of the questions a lot of text around U.S. values, human rights, freedom of expression, stuff like that. So, in order for students to successfully do well on the new SAT, they need to basically be indoctrinated with, U.S. values. And so it's kind of interesting how the battleground has shifted over to ideology. And clearly, people in China, they want to send their kids to the U.S. They see the U.S. universities as the best universities in the world. And now a gating factor will be to do well on an SAT, which by virtue of studying the SAT will help to spread U.S. ideology.
That is fascinating. I want to learn more about that. That's really quite interesting. I've got just a couple more questions. One is, what
Sure.
about the increased pressure regarding privacy? Are there I'm not talking so much here about censorship as I am about people in the West have gotten, especially recently, just really rabid about the sense of people getting a hold of their data and invading their privacy on all sorts of levels. How does that differ from how people in China feel, where they've had sort of a big brother situation for quite a while? Is there more of a not so strong a sense about protecting their own data and what they hold private to themselves?
Yeah, I don't think there's as much of a premium value placed on privacy. I think people just recognize that everything they do and say could be made available to the government, to the authorities, and so just be careful about what you do and say. I mean, Tencent is the biggest social media platform in China with I think 700-800 million users. And everyone knows that WeChat basically is allied with the government. They have people kind of looking at posts, and if it's something that's inappropriate, it gets taken down. And therefore, you're careful about what you put up there, what you share with your friends, because it's just recognized that there is no privacy. But I don't think people are as bent out of shape about that here. I think people recognize that I have a lot of freedom as long as I don't do anything to challenge the government. And for most people, they're fine with that. If you walk around in China, you feel very, very safe on the streets. You feel very, very safe about who you want to hang out with, what you want to do, where you want to work, where you want to live. So, on a day-to-day basis, I feel just as free in China as I do in America, providing I don't challenge the government. But in order for the government to make sure that they have control there is therefore no privacy. That's kind of the cost that society pays.
It's a transaction, and so far as both sides are feeling well paid.
Yeah, exactly, and you may, it's natural to kind of be lofty in one's ideals and say, oh, this is transactional. Why don't we aspire to higher standards? But again, if you are the Chinese government and you're trying to manage a country of this many people and trying to continue to lift them out of poverty and continue to bring them to a better future, you don't have room for a lot of dissent, because that just slows you down, right? So a lot of people, even though Xi Jinping is kind of clamping down on the media, he's clamping down on NGOs. There's not a lot of value placed on privacy and on human rights. But for most people in China, they sense that the country is still moving in the right direction. And a lot of people worry about, well, what if Xi gets assassinated? What if he gets taken out? That's what a lot of people are worried about. So the country is becoming a little bit more draconian. That's also a transaction. You recognize that maybe you need to give up a little bit of freedom today in exchange for more freedom in the future. So I think that's kind of a mental transaction that most people make here in this country.
So, Lyndon, what would you say is the biggest source of your optimism about China's future?
Two things. One is the size. One is the size of China. So, China continues to be, the biggest market in the world, and under this benevolent dictatorship construct, leaders are not distracted by elections. The country has kind of a state. It's kind of amazing that a country of this size peacefully transitions power. It's not through an election, but peacefully transitions power from generation to generation. And stability is very, very good for China. You take a look at Switzerland, right? It's this neutral country that has evaded wars throughout the centuries. It's prospered. It's prospered because it's had the luxury of stability, of continuing to companies continuing to grow in accordance with their strategies. The country continues to grow unencumbered, undistracted by wars. I think that's what China is trying to do, is trying to grow stably, but in order to maintain that stability, unfortunately, it comes at a price to other elements which are important, which are very, very good, but which maybe compared with stability and continuing to move the country towards greater prosperity, needs to be sacrificed in the short term. So that's one source of optimism, that that I have confidence, I guess, in the leadership in China, and in general in a benevolent dictatorship type of model. It's kind of weird for me to say this, but I just see it having achieved quite a lot over the past few years, and that helps to feed my optimism.
So, if you had a source of pessimism, what would the major challenge? What do you see as a major challenge? The thing that could blow this system? War. I see that. Anytime you have a transition of geopolitical power, a big transition of geopolitical power, usually it's difficult to do so without conflict. You look at the transition of power from Europe to the States. There are two world wars, which transpire, and so it's people get uneasy, and in a world where a lot of problems persist. Most countries are in debt. It doesn't look like things are getting much better.
companies are basically using quantitative easing and just printing money in order to stave off current problems and shove them out to the future. In an environment like that, people are looking more inward. So in hindsight, not surprised about Brexit. In hindsight, not surprised about the Donald Trump phenomenon. People are a little bit more inward, more focused on, okay, so what can I get, even if it's at other people's expense, rather than, more outward and more global. And so I think what might derail this whole thing is if there's a war, which I'm increasingly worried about, because we've been very lucky in our generation, but I don't know about my kids.
And if there were, over what would that be?
I think it could be about territory, kind of like the South China Seas right now, kind of like the Ukraine and Russia, about territory, about assets, natural resources.
Well, this has been just such an interesting conversation. I thank you, Lyndon. It's been a delight to share your perspective.